still is farewell, and maybe we'll come back to earth. Who can tell? I guess there is no one to blame. We're leaving ground. Will things ever be the same again? It's the final countdown. We're heading for Venus, and still we stand tall. 'Cause maybe they've seen us, and they will.
Just social media-ing it, and we are good.
With so many light years to go and things to be found. Yeah, I'm sure that we'll miss her so. It's the final countdown.
I didn't even know we had a theme song. Awesome. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Dr. Dunning and Mr. Kruger show. I am your host, Chad Bogard, aka Dr. Dunning, along with my co-host, Mr. Kruger, also known as Nicole Eichenberg. Our guests tonight will be Damian Harmony and Willie Travis. Willie's here.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on. Appreciate it. Damian will be joining us shortly.
I'm here, aren't I?
There he is.
What?
Sorry, buddy, we missed you there.
No.
He's in the background.
Up there.
Oh, they call me Damien the Wallflower for a reason, you know.
See.
So,
All right, so we're going to basically today be debating a bunch of conspiracy theories. We've all done copious research, especially Damien, because he's an historian, as he put it. So Damien, would you like to kick us off with your first conspiracy theory?
yeah, sure. Pearl Harbor was not a conspiracy. So there's a lot of people out there that say that U.S. government officials had advanced knowledge of Pearl Harbor. because the United States government wanted to get into the war, and therefore they let Pearl Harbor get sneak attacked so that we'd have a pretense for getting in. So that's the kernel of it. The first person who came up with this was a guy named John T. Flynn. He was a journalist who was part of the America First Committee. Yeah, those people. So he comes up with this theory, this hypothesis, as he called it, in 1944. The spokesman of the American First Committee was famed pilot, famed anti-Semite, famed guy whose baby got kidnapped and then killed, Charles Lindbergh. The AFC itself deserves mention here because they were broad-reaching in their influence, starting in Yale in 1940. A bunch of students Yale students, I point that out on purpose. They included the son of the guy who invented Quaker Oats, which is weird, a future Supreme Court justice, Potter Stewart, which is a cool name for such a tool, John F. Kennedy and Gerald Ford both gave money to this group. Interestingly, this group, although it had hundreds of thousands of members, it got almost half of its funding from about 6 millionaires. Which, I mean, could you imagine that, right? A group that seems to have a lot of followers and yet it's funded by just 6 people. I mean, that would be insane. People would see right through that. It's a good thing we've learned. And of course, right, journalists. So Mr. Flynn, the journalist who was all about America First, actually, when the war started, he supported the war effort because America First means then, bombing people. But in 1944, he writes a 25-page treatment on how FDR knew ahead of time that Pearl Harbor would be a target. And he was so convincing that the owner of the Chicago Tribune printed the whole thing in his newspaper. Could you imagine the owner of a newspaper thinking that this right-wing guy who is dabbling in conspiracy theories is going to make money off of this? It's just crazy. Again, thank goodness we've learned our lesson.
Well, real quick, let me just point out that as somebody who grew up in the Midwest and is a Chicago Cub fan, nothing the Chicago Tribune could do, but I put it past them. So, yeah. You're right. You got me on the other ones, but not this one.
So, and I would point out 1944 is an election year. So the Chicago Tribune is printing out a 25-page document aimed at taking the current president who's running for office down a notch if he can. Interestingly, though, Flynn does become an outspoken advocate against war in Southeast Asia after World War II is over. And he actually was on record saying he didn't believe that communism was really a threat. And in fact, the real threat is fascism, which is counter to the Truman Doctrine. So he kind of walked an interesting line there. And then he went to work for McCarthy, which is weird. So the gist of it, of his 25-page treatment, which is not fun to read, is that FDR and his inner circle are tried to goad Japan into a war as early as January 1941. And his proof was that the oil embargo and the sanctions that FDR had levied against Japan, and on and on. And he had further proof, I'll use finger quotes for that, further proof, because the guys in charge of the Army and the Navy in Hawaii, General Short and Admiral Kimmel, I don't know if he's related to Jimmy Kimmel, they were underinformed and thus would be caught off guard. So he's like, see, they should have known. And if they didn't know, then he was trying to get them. So he was angry that the Republicans at the time couldn't stand up to FDR. So he's like, this will really help him. Between 1941 and 1946, there were 9 investigations into this. Could you imagine that? Like just constantly running the same kind of investigation over and over to discredit somebody because you don't like their politics? Like that would be crazy. It's a good thing that we've learned our lesson. In 1995, there was a 10th investigation, for fuck's sake. It ended up still with no credible proof of conspiracy. But see, that's how they get you. When there's no proof of conspiracy, that just shows that that's how they did it.
Not good.
Yeah. So here's basically the questions that most conspiracy morons ask when they talk about Pearl Harbor, and they focus on a few of them because they sound very techie, and therefore they figure they can bully you into not understanding how ionospheres work. So first question, why else would all the battleships be at Pearl Harbor when all the carriers are out and about? So clearly a target, but we wanted to save our carriers. It was well known that FDR wanted to get into the war to help England against the Nazis. And look at how slick he was with the Lend-Lease Act. There you go. Look at how he provoked the government of Japan by doing all he could to block their oil, get them to fire the first shot, and then we don't have a choice. Because that way we'll go to war with the Nazis. Officials in Hawaii knew that there were Japanese carriers northwest of Honolulu. This is the Office of Naval Intelligence. This is what this guy is claiming. There is a memo called the McCullum Memo, which is also not fun to read. And it was like 8 or 9 pages of memo, like in that stupid-ass memo type. But it basically listed out 8 different reasons to goad Japan into war. And the Japanese codes had already been broken, so FDR had to have known. There was an American ship, the SS Lurleen, which it doesn't get more Dolly Parton than that. They had heard Japanese signal days before Pearl Harbor. So Kimmel and Short were never court-martialed. So, you know, they were let off easy. And there was a communication between FDR and Churchill in November of 41. So these are usually the nucleus of why. And anytime you prove one part of a conspiracy wrong, they immediately go, what about this thing? And they just shift it. So I've got paragraphs to take care of each one of those. What's that?
I don't doubt it.
Yeah. So the carriers were gone, specifically because 2 carriers were delivering airplanes to Wake Island and Midway Island, because those were actually considered under threat. So that makes sense. The 3rd carrier was in Puget Sound, Washington. It was getting refitted, and it was supposed to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, about an hour before the attack happened, but the weather was bad. So, also, nobody saw carriers as important as battleships in the outset of the war. Now, it later became obvious that they were, but no one knew that yet. Everybody saw carriers as just kind of a scouting mission kind of thing. They didn't realize how important they were. So everybody was still stuck fighting the old war, and that was battleships. It's true that FDR did want to go to war. He saw the dangers of fascism. Can you imagine a president seeing the dangers of fascism? Imagine.
Huh?
Yeah.
Who couldn't see the problem with that?
One would think, right? It's just... and he was close with Churchill, and he did want to help, but he was not able to make the case clearly to the American people, so he didn't. And he did do the Lend-Lease Act, which is a really clever way to get around it. So what we would do is America would lend materiel to the British, and they could just pay us back when they wanted to. And it turns out when they give us back the stuff to pay us back, they'd also give us the ships back. And we were like, wow, this ship suddenly has a lot more lead in it. What happened? Thanks for the improvements. And that just happened for, a couple of years. Like, we were the arsenal of their democracy. The U.S. did sanction the Japanese for their attacks on China, on Eastern Asia, for their brutalization of China in 1938. And because they violated the Geneva Convention, which is kind of tricky because Japan never signed the Geneva Convention. So, but the thing is, that's all America could do. We had the 17th strongest army in the world at that time, like no great shakes. Our Navy was not that great. Japan was on the march, but on sea, I don't know what that would be called, on the Wade. But the sanctions at that time were still kind of a new tool. They didn't really work against France to try to get France to stop starving Germany after the war. So we didn't have this long history of sanctions working. Currently, sanctions work about a third of the time, which is pretty good. From
a certain point of view.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're wanting a country to stop a thing, sanctioning them is infinitely better than bombing the shit out of them. Yeah. So,
learned.
what's that?
Thank God we've learned.
Exactly.
Have we?
Well, there's that. So strategically, the most likely targets were actually, we knew that Japan was going to run out of oil. We did know that they were thinking about attacking, but we figured it'd be Wake Island, Midway Island, or the Philippines. And by the way, it was Wake Island, Midway Island, and the Philippines, just not when Pearl was hit. Those places were actually placed on alert. And when asked later why he was underprepared, I think it was Admiral Kimmel, he said off the record, I didn't think the little yellow bastards would do it. And that's why he didn't really prepare. Also, there's no real clear chain of command. Pearl Harbor is an island, so the general is on the ground and he's in charge, but Pearl Harbor has a harbor, so the admiral in the water is in command, and they didn't have a clear top-down structure or how to share information. So regularly, naval intelligence would get information and not share it with Army, and Army intelligence would get stuff and not share it with naval. So nobody was actually holding all the data there.
Wow, that'd be like if there was an imminent terrorist attack and the FBI and the CIA were talking to each other.
Right? Thank God we learned.
Yeah, thank God that happened.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, they didn't know that the Japanese carriers were northwest of Honolulu. A lot of people are like, oh, well, they found out that the Japanese carriers were northwest of Honolulu because there was this guy who was a rear admiral of the Dutch Navy, like you do. And he had written in his diary that he had seen Japanese carriers. That's true. But whoever had read his diary didn't understand Dutch abbreviations for directions. And so when they read it, it looked like it said northwest, but in fact it meant westerly. And that meant the Marshall Islands, because what the fuck would the Dutch be doing that far north anyway? All of their stuff was in Indonesia. So if you have a map, it really helps understand that the Dutch were not that close to Honolulu. So they were not northwest of Honolulu, according to this guy. They were just westerly. And there were plenty of Japanese ships west of the Marshall Islands. Also, the man that brought this up, he had some very troubling ties later on to a California Holocaust denier group.
Seems to be a theme.
Yeah, a little bit. So the McCullum memo, this one is really big because Gore Vidal really liked it. Gore Vidal is a really good writer, and he's a lot of fun to listen to in an interview. He's very smart, very well spoken, which means that people who believe conspiracy theories would be like, see, he's on the left and we believe him.
Yep.
And the memo does exist. I read it. Again, not a fun read. It does outline a number of ways to goad the Japanese into action. However, it is a memo written by McCullum, who's a naval intelligence officer, and he specifically wrote it in order to discourage provoking the Japanese. And if we do these things, it's going to start a fight. So let's not. He had passed it on to two captains in the Pacific, and they'd written back to him. So it didn't even go up the chain past them, as far as I can tell. So there's literally no evidence that FDR had it, which, of course, conspiracy theorists are like, well, of course not, because then that wouldn't be a conspiracy. And here's where the techie nerds get really into it. Japanese code breaking. So it is, in fact, true that Americans had broken some Japanese codes, but the way that Japanese code breaking works is not like in the video game, where once you break it, then it all just falls into English. There were different kinds of codes, first of all. There were diplomatic codes, like purple, and that didn't get broken until later. There's J19, PAK2. Those are the big ones that, people who read Wikipedia will be like, and see, that's how it works. I could click on that link, and now I know all the things about it. But there were other codes that weren't broken. And even if you break a code, it's not like you see the Matrix all of a sudden when you've done it. You can break a code, and you still run into the problem of we're going from a Semitic language into a Germanic language with all the cultural things that are attached to both and the giant wide gulf that exists between them. And then they're going to be talking in different priorities and in different command structures, and they're going to be talking on multiple levels. And so even if you break the code, you don't necessarily know what it is that you're reading. It's much more lucky. It's much more uneven. As advanced as our code breaking was, and it's still very uneven too. It's kind of like when I put conditioner in my hair. So And also, let's say you break the code. That doesn't mean they're not constantly changing the code every month anyway. There's a reason we change our passwords, once every 6 months in my district. So that's not really a thing. And again, like I said, you've got compartmentalization, you've got different command structures, you've got human error, people fucking up codes all the time. So any of these can lead to misinterpreting a code, and then that just screws it up down the road. And then there's the sheer volume of information that you're getting in. Even before 9/11, we were only able to analyze about 10% of what the NSA was pulling in, and they were spying on everyone. Also, here's another problem with the code breaking. The Japanese kept strict naval radio silence. In fact, they went so far as to pull the fuses out of their communications device, and they put paper in between communications devices to make sure that you could not hit that circuit. It's possible that one of them had an antenna that was receiving, and it bounced a signal off the ionosphere, which can actually extend the range by thousands of miles. This is why AM radio, you can hear a lot farther at night. That would have only told us the direction, not actually where they were. So you would have known that there were Japanese ships to the west, which makes sense since Japan is to the west. The Japanese used lights and semaphore, no radios, and their internal reports were glowing about how successful their radio silence had been. In fact, they were really pissed that they broke it after the fact. There's a ship called the SS Lurleen, like I said. That's what people really hang their hat on about. This found the signals. Again, let's say that the Lurleen did in fact detect a radio signal. They still couldn't have tracked it. They would have only detected it. So now you just know that there's something out there. And there's still Wake Island and Midway Island in the Philippines. Kimmel and Short were not court-martialed. That's true. They were questioned by Congress fairly rigorously. And one of them, his Vice Admiral Libby, said that FDR must have known what was going to happen. But looking back, it looks a lot more like they were trying to keep secret that they'd broken Japanese codes. So that could have been smoke that they threw. Churchill and FDR had tons of correspondence that absolutely were about wanting the U.S. to go in against the Nazis. Churchill even said that the U.S. entry into the war would quiet down Japan. But if you think about it, if America goes into war against Japan, that's suddenly a whole bunch of guys they can't send to fight against Germany. So why would you go to Japan? Why not just let them get tied up in China like they were and then go attack the Nazis? Now, in fairness, so the U.S. in December 8th declares war on Japan. A couple days, but they don't declare war on Nazi Germany. A couple days later, the Nazis declare war on them, I think on December 12th, which is an important detail to keep in mind because they didn't actually have to, and it was specifically Nazi Germany that declared war on us. So the convolutedness of this is kind of ridiculous, except for the fact that World War I happened. And in World War I, there was a Bosnian Serb that shot the heir to the throne of the Austrian Empire in Sarajevo, and Austria put forth demands in July of 1914 for Serbia, which Serbia refused to answer, which led to Austria declaring war on Serbia, which led to Russia mobilizing against Austria, which led to the Kaiser of Germany asking his cousin, the Tsar of Russia, not to mobilize when Tsar Nicholas of Russia refused to not mobilize. That led Germany to mobilizing against Russia, which led to Germany invading Luxembourg and Belgium in order to invade France preemptively to knock them out before they could come to Russia's aid. And in the invasion of those countries, that led Britain to declaring war on Germany, and then Austria declaring war on Russia, leading Britain and France to declare war on Austria. Then Russia and Britain and France all declaring war on the Ottoman Empire, leading to the Ottoman Empire declaring war on Britain, France, and Russia, and leading to Italy declaring war on Austria, Germany, and the Austrian Empire. It's not like people hadn't seen really weird shit, a convoluted house of cards like that. So it's not entirely insane to think that FDR go to Japan into attacking the U.S. so he could trick the Nazis into declaring war on the U.S. to go to war with Japan.
I hope you all were taking notes.
Yeah. But here's the kicker. You remember that November communication that I was referencing before? That was a fraud. That never happened. So none of the shit that I just mentioned could have possibly happened. So was there a conspiracy to draw the U.S. into the war? No, there was not. There was a lack of imagination. There was a lot of bureaucratic failings and unpreparedness along the way, but there was no intent to draw us into the war. Mic drop.
Boom.
Boom.
I'd just like to point out, sorry, first, Chad?
Go for it.
Before I forget, you can see behind Damien, I'm sure you're all wondering, Capital Punishment is his pun show that right now is airing on Twitch every Friday at 8:30. It is every Tuesday now, excuse me.
Yep.
And also, it's usually at Luna's on the first Friday of the month at 8 o'clock p.m. Thank you, Damien.
Thank you.
That was awesome. I do have some questions for you real quick, but
Do it.
on that same vein, before we continue, Nicole and Willie, would you guys like to talk about your show also? Because I want you guys to get your plug in.
Oh, yes, you want to go for it, Willie?
Yeah, man. Me and Nicole do this this podcast where we take music. Our guests, four of us, me, Nicole, and two guests, both Chad and Damien have both been on the show. We've all had fun. We've all talked about music, all based around the theme, and we just have fun, man. The podcast is up. Look us up on Podbean, Willie Listen. And our website is coming up, Instagram, all that good stuff.
And generally, when people aren't getting sick, it's on the third Friday of the month at Stab Comedy Theater on 1710 Broadway at 8 p.m. every third Friday of the month.
So you can go to both our shows in a month. Piece of cake.
And can life get any better? No, it cannot.
Do it.
And with any chance this takes off, and now you'll have 3 shows you can watch.
Hell yeah.
There it
Fingers
is.
crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Willie, what would you like to get into? What grinds your gears?
2 quick questions for Damien, real quick.
Oh yeah.
So what about, I think I've heard you mention this before, what about the theory that the only reason the U.S. wanted to get involved in World War II was because England and France owed us money?
That's
I
true.
that. I wanted to see what
Yeah.
you thought, real quick.
That's true, but then us spending more money, it's not one of those kinds of things. No, it was much more about ideology, and it was much more about stopping the rise of fascism. Also, keep in mind, in America, there was a Nazi Bund, and those guys were assholes. They did sell out Madison Square Garden once, which is weird, and they also set up a lot of really cool summer camps in upstate New York, which is also weird, considering that a lot of those summer camps ended up being drama camps for middle-aged Jewish kids. But in terms of them owing us money, that wasn't the issue. Yeah, because we were paying Germany so that then Germany could pay France so that France and England could pay us. But yeah, we didn't mind so much.
So it would be the wartime equivalent of taking money out of the ATM to chase money you just lost at the poker table.
Oh yeah, very. You know,
Okay.
you got to spend money. Doesn't make sense when it comes to that.
And I also wish to point out, I mean, it sounds surprising that Nazis would sell out Madison Square Garden, but let's not forget the Knicks still sell out Madison Square Garden.
It's a good
Right,
point.
right.
Well,
I mean, if
doing
people
it.
are taking to see that, then the last question I have to ask,
Mhm.
you're talking about the code breaking.
Yes.
would it be safe to say that it was an older code, but it checked out?
Indeed, and they should admit them. Yeah.
I just had to get that one.
Yeah, I like it.
Who was the Lurleen named after?
That I couldn't find, and I don't even know if I'm saying it right. It's Lurline. So
Are there Lurleens left? Are they extinct? There's no more Lurleens.
they're probably extinct on this coast, but I wouldn't put it past people in the Midwest still using that name for some reason.
You can probably find them complaining to the managers at Golden Corral.
Or a show.
Endangered, if not extinct.
Yeah.
All right, anything else for Damien?
Thank you.
Thanks. That's awesome.
Yep. What do you have to share with us today, Willie?
MK Ultra is alive and well. It is a thing still. I'm telling you now. What is MK Ultra? All right, look. So MK Ultra were the CIA projects, right? They were performed on these. They were these tests performed on people using drugs like heroin, ecstasy, mushrooms, but their go-to was LSD. They used it to study mind control and gathering information. This was like from the 50s to like mid 70s or so. There was a MK Ultra project in particular called Operation Midnight Climax. It was held in it was held in San Francisco and New York City. And what this was the CIA used prostitutes to lure in dudes to these safe houses where they would dose these guys with LSD and watch and listen through two-way mirrors and recorders that they used planted as outlets. In '53, Frank Olson, the CIA scientist, he drank a cocktail that was actually spiked with LSD, and like a few days later, he jumped out of his hotel room in New York City. What's pretty crazy was that in 1994, the Olson family actually chose to have the body go through a second autopsy, and they found that there was like bodily damage. So, you know, the theory really is that he was assassinated by the CIA, and you know, maybe they didn't want their secrets getting out there, their goodies. I wouldn't want my goodies getting out there. But eventually, the Olson family settled with $750,000, and they even got a recognition from Gerald Ford. So that was pretty crazy. And then in '62, I guess the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Mm-hmm.
He
Ken Kesey.
Kim Kesey, yes. He volunteered for MK Ultra while he was in college at Stanford. And eventually, what he really did was what they were doing, you know, while they were watching these guys, you know, trip balls through these like two-way mirrors, you know, like they're on this side, you know, drinking cocktails and shit, just, you know, lapping it up. Because, you know, it sounds pretty funny when you think about it. And it's like the 50s. Like, this is some cool shit. It's like TV, right? And, you know.
Yeah, if you're enough of a sociopath, I bet it probably was.
Well, I work for the CIA.
One of those drugs guys who seduces men and then doses them. That sounds like a great Saturday night to me. I mean,
Yeah. Just add liquor. And
I'd watch the documentary. I'd watch the movie. I'd watch a fictional account. It sounds great. But
notes for the future. All right, anybody? Billy, do you have anything more?
Well, no. What was crazy was just that Ken Kesey, this guy, he brought in this whole like culture, because like they threw parties eventually, and I guess like the main guy from Grateful Dead, he was there, you know, doing these drugs and stuff, and it was shut down in '73. But now, you know, what the, you know, theory is now is that, you know, it's actually within like all of our like figureheads, our sports entertainers, our, you know, personalities and stuff. And there's a lot of videos of supposedly, you know, these celebrities kind of glitching or malfunctioning, you know, freezing in place. You can search for Shaq, you can search for like, you know, Bill Clinton, Cardi B, 2 Chainz. You know, it's pretty weird stuff. But that's it.
Very cool.
Nice.
All right. Anyone have any questions or things to add for Willie and MK Ultra?
oh, of course I do. First of all, I want to point out how frightened I am. Because, I've got an 1/8 of Midnight Climax in the other room, and I was terrified.
But share the wealth, man.
It's actually called Bubba. And what really drives this whole LSD thing home for me is, you know, I know you guys all know me as the fine, upstanding family man that I am now, but I was a rave kid in the early 90s in San Francisco. I've ingested a fair share of LSD in my time, and even if you're expecting it, it's fucking wild. So I cannot imagine what it must have been like for these poor people to all of a sudden, like, because you could feel it coming on.
Right.
Like all of a sudden you're like, you know, and then La La Land. You know, when you're expecting it, it's great. But
Well, like, I've done 4 tabs of acid one time. I never intended to, I didn't think that was a lot of acid. You know what I mean? I could definitely see where you would jump out of a fucking New York City window.
Yeah, it's interesting with that because the Merry Pranksters used what was known as Owsley acid. So the patent for LSD ran out right around the early 60s. And this guy from England, last name Owsley, he developed a really, really potent strand, a batch of it. And he, made a ton of it. And he's the guy that the Beatles were hanging with. And the Grateful Dead were down with it. And Velvet Underground was before they got into heroin. And they would do this thing called the electric strawberry Kool-Aid test. So if you were going to be at this party, people would walk around with squirt guns dosing your drink. And so if you went to certain parties in Haight-Ashbury in the 60s, expect to get dosed. And so it was a really weird thing. And the CIA was doing it as a way to try to develop a truth serum and also see if they could create sleeper agents and stuff like that. None of which worked, of course. But yeah, it's something. Chad, when you were raving in the 90s, did you do, first off, just picturing you in those Jankos, but
no, not Jankos. I'll see if I can find a picture for you guys. I wore a pair of size 48 XL overalls.
Nice.
And
bread, yeah.
Oh no, it gets even better than that. I had a Cypress Hill baseball jersey.
Wow.
That I wore.
Okay, so when you did all this, did you ever do ecstasy, MDMA?
Yeah.
Did you ever hit some that was just like amazing? Like you still remember it? You're like, wow, that shit was amazing.
I took it a few times, and it never really did anything for me.
Okay.
I would hear these stories about people taking it, and it would last for 6 to 8 hours, and they have this great time. It would hit about an hour and a half, and done. So then someone said take both at the same time. That was interesting. They call that candy flipping. But still, I'm more of a purist.
Okay. Well, the MDMA that was hitting the rave scene in the late 90s was developed by a South African cardiologist who had previously tried to defertilize African women in South Africa. And then he developed MDMA as a way to deaden the senses of the South African Black community so that they wouldn't be as politically astute.
You know so much about everything.
I'm an historian.
Hey.
Man, they need you in them streets, Damien.
I was in those streets today.
Oh, yeah, you were, huh?
I was. So.
Yeah, Damien also has a podcast called A Geek History of Time, and this should be surprising to absolutely no one.
I am a white guy with a beard, so it came with the starter kit.
So, Chad, what would you like to discuss?
Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
What would you like to discuss, Chad? What's on your mind?
Oh, well, thank you. One of my all-time favorite conspiracy theories. Little quick background. I spent a lot of time, once upon a time, going to church, playing in the band. I even did church stand-up comedy for a while.
Oh.
I know, it doesn't sound like it's really a thing. It sounds like I made it up, but it's not. And I have encountered multiple people in my lifetime who subscribe to the theory that the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Young Earth theory, of course. And very specifically, what they believe is that fossils aren't real. That fossils were planted by Satan himself to lead mankind astray and towards science and away from God. and make them believe in evolution, which is the most ridiculous fucking thing I've ever heard in my life. I absolutely love it because you're basically talking about people who think the Flintstones could have been a documentary. I mean, it drives me insane to think that people, this supernatural being with all this otherworldly power was, no. Let me hide the bones of dead animals in the earth for them to find sometime in the 1800s.
Right.
Going to throw the whole thing for a loop. Yeah.
It's like a supernatural, long con version of a scavenger hunt for a birthday.
Yeah. I mean, get an idea of how deep this goes. I mean, it's one thing to have someone argue with you that, creationism has to be true because there's no way that even over billions of years, something as complex as the eye evolved. But let's not get into that. I just can't believe that I've actually had, not just the people I go to church with do this, but I've heard pastors do sermons where they actually say to the entire group of people, carbon dating is not real, and it's really easy to find scientists who disagree with it. And I'm like, what Christian school did they go to? Because nobody outside of that sphere has any reason to. I mean, it's been fought and tested, and it comes back every time. It's like, yeah, it works. Is it super 100% accurate? No. But when you're talking within a range of what? A couple 100,000 years over the course of billions?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're talking, and that's the thing that gets me. Because one thing I've noticed, and I'm sure you guys have all seen this too, with conspiracy theorists, I heard someone describe it this way, the best way. When you have something that people just can't comprehend or understand, they need something that makes it more palatable to them. So rather than go with the idea that, in Damien's example, that Japan committed the atrocity where they flew over to Pearl Harbor and bombed us, no. They couldn't have just done that unprovoked. Something had to have happened. So the theory that our own president, and then of course we see the almost exact same thing with 9/11, where people are like, no, this could not have happened. There had to be an inside job. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams, and et cetera, that kind of nonsense. And it just gets a life of its own, and then flat Earth theory and the moon landing, which I think Nicole was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So it's always blown my mind that, and it's one of the reasons I don't go to church anymore, because I started realizing like the people I'm surrounded by, I went to church with people who were, also like me, software engineers and, tech people and science and all this stuff. And at the same time, they're trying to tell me that, no, the Earth's only about 6,000 years old. And I'm like, what? Like the first time I heard that, I was just like, I had to ask the guy to repeat it. It came during a conversation about the movie Jurassic Park.
Oh God.
Yeah, the actual conversation was the first one, Chris Pratt. We were talking about it, and he's all, we were talking about the movie, and he's all, that's not real, right? And I'm all, yeah, they don't have that technology yet. I mean, I'm sure someday someone's going to figure out splice dinosaur DNA, and we're going to get them because they've already been trying to clone mammoths. So why not?
Right.
And I was like presenting it, yeah, it's possible someday. Who knows what they're going to come up with? And he's like, no, it's not real. The fossils aren't real. Those are fake. And at that point, my mind just kind of like, what? And then he went into this whole diatribe about how the Earth can only be so old and fossils aren't real and other stuff. And I just like, so then I started looking into it, and I'm like, how many of the people that I sit with every Sunday morning believe this? And far more terrifying than I thought it was. It's like, oh my God, I'm surrounded by people who can't handle basic, well, at the end of his life, Darwin believed in God. Well, that has nothing to do with evolution. I mean,
he also ate all the turtles that he brought with him back from the Galapagos. That doesn't mean we all need to eat all.
Exactly.
Like that's not how it works.
Yeah, and as I told somebody one time, one doesn't necessarily, if you want to believe, that's great, but there's no reason to believe that God can just go, okay, let's see what happens. I'll check back in a billion. So we have the proof to show that this to this to this to fossil record, geological record.
When there's a link in that chain that's missing, then they got you. And then you find the link in that chain, and then they're like, oh, now there's a hole on either side. And you're like, what the? No, like that's my favorite. When they're like, okay, well, there's a gap here, and we're like, okay, now we got the fossil to fill that gap. And they're like, now there's 2 gaps. And it's like, God damn it.
Yeah, you can never. We have proof that certain types of humanoids all existed at the same time.
I'm in Neanderthal.
Oh, I have more respect for you than that. I won't say it in public, but
no, most redheads are actually of Neanderthal stock.
I did not know that.
Yep.